Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm No02. And a couple of weeks ago, I began an endeavor to sort of put the confusion or the question, why hazard pay over money grubbers, or any discussion on money grubbers, let's put it to rest. Let's get the data. Let's figure it out. Let's really quantify what value money grubbers can potentially get you. Uh, even way back before they nerfed money grubbers, I was on team hazard pay. And I just felt like I only played nightmare mode at that point, right? You can only play online if you wanted to make progress. And I didn't see money grubbers providing that consistency that hazard pay obviously provides. So even before they nerfed it, I was sort of already leaning towards hazard pay. They ended up testing, some players in the community ended up testing the value of money grubbers. But from what I recall distinctly is that the testing that they did was on resurgence and on recruit mode, and they just ran that like 20 or 30 times or something like that. And of course, money grubbers was, oh man, you can get to the end of the first mission and have like 2,000 copper. And if everybody runs money grubbers, you can have 2,000 copper per player at the end of each mission. If you complete the secondary objective, like 2,500 copper per, it's like right. But I just felt in my heart of hearts, that really on nightmare mode, particularly at that time, I was playing a lot with bots because by the time I got into Act 2 and Act 3 on nightmare mode, there was nobody there. I was just playing by myself at that point because the game was still new. Most people who are in nightmare mode were still stuck in Act 1. The players who had beaten the game on nightmare mode played with their friends and teammates, and they've already gone through that stuff. So for the most part, I was playing by myself, and just the realization of like the state of the bots back then, even though we could manipulate them a little bit to be more aggressive and stuff, the reality of trying to loot an entire map so that money grubbers can pop off consistently was just didn't feel viable. But here, I have made every effort humanly possible to loot every single map entirely, as much as I could. I discovered new places where copper can spawn and things like that, and just got the feel for finding and counting piles of copper. We're counting piles of copper because Money Grubbers gives us bonus copper per pile that we pick up. I talk about this in my economy video about hazard pay versus Money Grubbers and things like that. If you don't know, you need 13 piles of copper. Currently, in the current state of Money Grubbers, you need 13 piles of copper in order for it to be better than hazard pay. Hazard pay gives you 250 copper. At 13 piles of copper, Money Grubbers will give you like 272 or something like that. At 16 piles of copper, Money Grubbers will give you 402 piles of copper. Just slightly better than Share the Wealth. Right? We can view copper from an individual point of view, which I typically do because I play solo queue. But if you're playing in a team setting, just like all of my team composition videos have, all 4 players have Share the Wealth, which is a net gain of 400 copper per card, per Share the Wealth. So you need 16 piles of copper to pretty much break even with Share the Wealth. Really, we want 17 because we're not going to run Money Grubbers because we want to mid-max 2 pieces of copper or something like that, right? So, is Money Grubbers really that good? Is it reliable? Is it consistent? Because the idea of Money Grubbers is that the ceiling is really high. The potential, the dream are in the sky, right? Your dreams should be in the sky, right? Money Grubbers' dreams are in the sky. Couple of elements to this test. I did everything possible to loot every map no matter what. For some of the maps, I even recorded myself so that I can go back and count and recheck my work. I played over 120 plus games, grinding, recording, counting, using a calculator, things like that, right? I also did offline and online. Just because, as far as I could tell, before I did this testing, offline is easier than online mode. So we're going to be seeing if offline and online mode are actually different. the consistency of money grubbers with and without copper scav. And we'll also just see some general patterns as far as what maps are really good for copper and what maps are not. Because one thing that I thought was like, oh, 1-1, right? Resurgence, the very first mission. That's a great map for copper. Like every single room in that starting apartments has the potential to spawn 2 or 3 piles of copper. And then there's copper spawns on the rooftop. And then in the construction zone at the end there's copper spawns. And then you go into the little side room at the truck yard, there's copper spawns in there. And then there's a little car outside and a dumpster that spawns copper. And there's an end, like, I thought, like, there's probably 100 potential spawns. Like, so, like, Resurgence will be our baseline as far as, like, what I imagined in my head to be a really copper-heavy map. And you'll see in the data a little interesting pattern that we got as far as how it goes. So let's look at the data. This is offline Resurgence 10 times. 10 times, right? So I did it 10 times Recruit, 10 times Nightmare with Copper Scav. Then I repeated that for no Copper Scav with Recruit and Nightmare. So a total of 40 times I played Resurgence offline. In Recruit mode, you can see 19 and 20s. 19s and 20s. In fact, 20 was so consistent that it feels like these 19s might be human error. Which I should talk about the variables in this thing. In this research, in my data. There, of course, are variables. The number one variable is probably human error. Me picking up a pile of copper and then forgetting to mark it down. Or sometimes the bots would pick up a pile of copper and I wouldn't be looking away or doing something or shooting at a tall boy. I may not notice the little blip on my screen. Things like that. Some other variables, though, cars. If cars explode, any loot that's inside of them, completely destroyed. As well as there might be potentially a place where I didn't discover that could spawn copper, but I'm fairly convinced that I know just about all of the copper spawns, especially on Resurgence, by heart at this point. One thing here that that's not really reflected in the data, but I felt while doing this offline grind for Resurgence, is a sort of flow of how the copper spawned. So I was right about Resurgence having tons of potential spawns, but never did I ever feel like I was going to get more than 20. The interesting thing that happened that I just felt in my heart of hearts was this ebb and flow of how the copper pile spawns. There's way more than 20 potential spawn points for copper on Resurgence. Way more. But if I would leave the apartment buildings with like 14 or 15 piles of copper, right, the first half of the map, the second half of the map that still has potentially 20-ish piles of copper spawns potentially there, it would be almost empty. It would almost be empty. There was a couple of these rounds here on Recruit where I left the construction area with 20 piles of copper. Then I checked that little side room and the car and the dumpster and the office and the storage room before the safe room. Empty. Completely empty. Abnormally empty. For the most part, the map would have a little bit of copper everywhere, slowly building up to eventually what would be 20. But in some of these circumstances where if the first half of the map was super heavy on copper, the second half of the map would be almost empty. And then vice versa as well. The first half of the map would be almost empty, and the second half of the map towards the end, towards the safe room, would be filled with copper. And it gave this impression, it gave me this feeling that at least on Resurgence, there is a cap, a literal maximum of what copper can be spawned. Now, I'm sort of a introvert. I know I've encountered some of you online. I probably could have asked some of you to help me with this idea, because I could have asked some of you to run Copper Scav with me, and then we play matches together. At least to test that theory out on online mode, because if we had more cards of Copper Scav, would Recruit go over 20? I don't know. If you're interested in testing that out, please test it out and leave a comment somewhere or whatever. I'm done doing the science. I can't handle it anymore. I'm not the scientist, that's Swing Point's job. But there was this ebb and flow to the copper pile. And for the most part, looking at 20 and 19 piles of copper, I was like, oh yeah, Resurgence looks pretty dang heavy on the copper. Nightmare mode with copper scav, right, we're offline. 16s and 15s. Surprisingly consistent. Again, some variables here, right? Maybe I missed something, maybe a car exploded, things like that. Also, too, like if things went bad and the bots were dying, or I was under pressure, being chased by something, in theory, that would increase my chances of having to miss something because I'm trying not to die. I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible because it's quite a grind. So there are some variables as far as this data probably goes. One important thing that I should mention about the variables is that they are accurate reflections of what you're going to be facing online anyways. So some of this data might have less piles of copper, or maybe even more. But particularly for having less piles of copper when there was more on the map, that's just going to be the reality of having money grubbers online anyways. Having a car blow up, not having the time to look for it because everyone on your team is dying and you need to get going. Those things will happen all the time, in solo queue especially, where sometimes you just can't loot the entire map because doing so is too risky. Like, running to the shed to go look inside the shed and getting potentially trapped inside because you want to see if there's a pile of copper in there is not going to be worth dying or throwing the mission over. You just wouldn't do that normally online. So as far as the variables go in all of this data, I think they're all acceptable variables in that they're going to accurately reflect what you can humanly possibly do on any given mission at any given time when playing Nightmare mode in particular. But surprisingly consistent for Nightmare with Copper Scav. 16s and 15s. Definitely makes money grubbers pretty valuable. For the most part, breaks even with Share the Wealth. Now, no Copper Scav. Unbelievably consistent. At this point, for recruit mode, it's just all 18s. Literally all 18s. And this is sort of the moment where I went, you know what? These 19s are probably human error. Because I could not believe how consistent this was. Offline, recruit mode, no copper scav, just 18 solid. And it sort of makes copper scav not look that good because it's just 2 more piles of copper. Just 2 more. Now, if we were running money grubbers, then for sure, yeah, 2 more piles of copper. Between 18 and 20, those are big numbers. Those are big potential numbers, but it's just 2 more. Sort of interesting, right? Nightmare, though. Nightmare with no copper scav, 13, 12, 14, 12, 13, 14, 1 anomalous, 16, and then 12s. Okay, a little more variable. This is what I expected more of. As far as running this 10 times, only 3 times did I not net gain more copper than hazard pay. Right, just barely got over hazard pay most of the time. One time we broke even with Share the Wealth. This is the point where I thought, well, if this is Resurgence, and I felt Resurgence is probably a very copper-heavy mission, this doesn't bode well for money grubbers. Doesn't bode well for money grubbers, because if this is going to be a mission that's copper-heavy, and this is what it looks like, money grubbers can only get worse from here, right? That was my initial thought. But sort of just accurately reflects that most of the time, money grubbers will probably trigger, but sometimes it won't. Let's look at online Resurgence. Now, at this point, I was getting very worn out. I did online Resurgence last, just so you guys know. I did online Resurgence last. And I justify this by just saying, if we get to this point, or we established our patterns here with offline Resurgence 10 times, 40 times. Let's just do it 5 times, 20 times total, 5 times for each category, and see if the pattern reflects online mode. Interestingly enough, recruit online with Copper Scav, 20s across the board. Nightmare, 16s and 15s. It's the same thing. No copper pile, run recruit mode, 18s solid. And then for Nightmare, 13s and 14s. Pretty much the same. Pretty much the same. It reflects exactly the pattern that we established here is being reflected online, which I thought online was going to be different than offline. Well, let's kick it up a notch. We're going from resurgence to bad seeds. We have online with copper scav, offline with copper scav, 1-1 to bad seeds. Way more data. Let's right. This is sort of, we're skimping out on the data here just to see if the pattern reflects. It does, at least on resurgence. Resurgence seems to be a super consistent map. Super consistent. Super consistent. That's a superpower. Anyways, but let's go over to doing 10 missions in a row. We have resurgence, online copper scav, offline copper scav. Online 15, 14, and 14. Offline 14, 16, and 15. We sort of get that same pattern of resurgence seems to be fairly consistent between online and offline. Let's look at Blood Tunnel though. 18s and 16s. 18s and 16s. Online and offline. Interestingly enough, if we go look at the data on Recruit real fast here, if you look at Blood Tunnels, 20, 21, 21. Pain Train, 24, 23, 24. This is offline with Copper Scav and no Copper Scav and Recruit mode. And I should have went to this first, I'm sorry. And you can see the numbers, 24s, 23s. Look at Queen Sweep with 23s and 21s. Bookworms sort of came to realize that, Resurgence may not be as copper heavy as I thought. Resurgence seems to be super consistent, but it is not the peak of copper pile potential here. The pattern that we get from this is just that Resurgence is not tippity tops. In fact, almost every single mission after it had way more potential for copper, which means that Money Grubbers is weakest on Resurgence and gets better on the other missions. But let's look here. Blood Tunnel online 18s and 16s, offline 18, 17, 20. For the most part, we'll consider that even. Online and offline still reflecting each other pretty well here. Pain Train 17, 16, 17. Offline though, 17 and 18s. We sort of get a little bit of a feel that maybe online might have less copper spawns than offline, but really nothing too conclusive here. The Crossing 19, 18, 17, 17, 18, 18. About the same. Really all just about the same. Interestingly enough, there is tons of copper on the Crossing. In fact, there is three cars on the bridge that are copper spawns. On the bridge. And then there's a couple of the backs of trucks on the bridge. At least one. Two truck beds that also have potential copper spawns. Plus all the cars and vehicles on the bottom floor of the boat as well. In addition to that, all the random copper spawns that spawn on the seats. The Crossing was surprisingly filled with copper. So if you're brave and got a little bit of movement speed, the Crossing is like copper heaven. Right? Clean Sweep, 17, 16s, 18, 16, 18. Now remember, we're using copper scav. So perhaps now at this point, we might be looking at this data and go, oh man, offline and online, pretty consistent. Pretty dang consistent. But maybe it's copper scav, right? Because up until this point, our consistency is from resurgence, and then all this recruit data, it really felt like recruit had very little variability. Very little variability as far as resources spawning in recruit mode, even with copper scav or without it. Barroom Blitz about the same, 19s and 18s. Special Delivery, 18s and 18s and 16s, 116 here. The Diner, right? 19, 16, 17, 18, 20. Bad Seeds. I wanted to do 10 missions, just for the sake of data, but I also wanted to do, just like how Resurgence was a map in my mind that I thought would be really copper heavy, Bad Seeds was a map in my mind that I thought would be really copper light. Especially because that first half of Bad Seeds, the path just to get to the farm, felt like there was very little loot spawns just in general. Didn't think there was going to be a lot of loot spawns on those rural maps. Well, if you have Copper Scav at least, 17s and 16s and 18s, Bad Seeds is good. Bad Seeds is good. Up until this point, as far as we can tell, if you run Copper Scav, you will trigger Money Grubbers. Money Grubbers will pop off, is what we're getting here, right? If you run Copper Scav, Money Grubbers will pop off. And a lot of the times, at least on these 10 missions, you're popping off to the point where you're getting more copper than Share the Wealth provides for the whole team, right? Let's jump down to online and offline without Copper Scav, right? This is all Nightmare. No Copper Scav now. Let's look at Resurgence. 11, 14, and 13. Sort of reflects the data that we already found for the most part, as far as Resurgence is concerned. Offline, right? 13, 12, and 13. About the same. It's all about the same. But look at Blood Tunnel. Look at Blood Tunnel 11, 13, and 13. No Copper Scav, right? Blood Tunnel with Copper Scav? 18s. 18s almost across the board. No Copper Scav? We're barely breaking even. Offline? Oh, look at offline. 16, 14, 14. Feels a little more consistent. Pain Train, 17, 13, 15. Pain Train offline, though, 17, 18, 17. Uh-oh. It's really starting to look like offline is easier than online as far as spawns go. The Crossing, 18, 15, 12, 16, 15, 16. Probably about the same. Clean Sweep, 9, 12, and 13. This 9 is probably because a car blew up, is my guess. Right? But Clean Sweep, offline, 18, 12, and 12. I don't know where the 18 came from, but it happened. Bookworms, 11 across the board, but offline, 15, 14, and 15. Barroom Blitz, 14 consistently. Offline, almost 17 consistently. Special Delivery, 12, 10, and 13. Special Delivery, offline, 17s and 16. The Diner, 12 and 13. The Diner offline, 10, 15, and 13. This 10 is definitely because a car exploded. 100% because a car exploded. And then Bad Seeds, 12, 12, 13. But then Bad Seeds offline, 16, 15, and 16. So, I'm not going to say that anything here is super duper conclusive because there are quite a bit of variables that I just accepted. Because those variables accurately reflect what you're just going to naturally experience online gameplay anyways. Cars blowing up, not having the opportunity to loot everything. I will reassure you though, in all of these 60 missions, 120 missions here, I did everything. I lost missions because I forced myself to look and loot everything. At least look. Literally go everywhere, check every car, check every corner, etc. So as far as scouring the maps entirely, this data, I would say, accurately reflects as much human effort as possible. But things just happen sometimes. Sometimes your teammates kill an exploder, and it's standing next to a car, and the car goes boom as well. It just happens, you just don't get to know. Interestingly enough, here it does seem like that between online and offline, without Copper Scav, online has less than offline. Almost consistently. So if you don't have Copper Scav and you're playing online, then yes, Money Grubbers all of a sudden becomes really unreliable, actually. Really unreliable. Now, Resurgence is not the pinnacle of what the potential is, right? All of the other maps seem to have naturally higher caps or naturally higher potential than Resurgence did. Some of these maps are a little bit longer than Resurgence as well and things like that. It also sort of showed me that the game is willing to spawn copper in weird places, like Bad Seeds. There are copper spawns in that first half of the mission, places where I didn't know. There's a big old puddle of water, just like when you get to the bottom of the first hill and you're leaving the safe room, there's a big old puddle of water and a truck, and the truck has like usually loot around it. In that puddle of water, there is a loot spawn, literally in the center of it. In fact, if you don't have copper scav on, it's kind of hard to see the pile of copper in the puddle because it's like dirty water. But there is, I've also seen pain pills spawn in that puddle of water as well. So when you get to that truck at the bottom, look in the center of the pond because there's potential spawn, potential loot spawn there. Also, there's a gate that like ridden spawn and jump over, a little farm gate in that same area. If you're like standing at the bed of the truck, looking down the path that you're going to take to continue the mission, turn right until you see a little gate, little pathway that sort of leads into that dirty pond. There's copper pile spawns there as well as off of the sides and the bushes and things like that. There's random copper spawns. So it felt like, or at least made me realize that on the rural maps, where it felt like there wasn't going to be very many natural spawns, at least for bad seeds is concerned, there's more than you think. There's more than you think. So, for the most part, what does this data teach us? One, it looks like Copper Scav removes a lot of the variability between online and offline mode. Copper Scav, online and offline, incredibly similar. Incredibly similar. No Copper Scav, online and offline, offline suddenly starts to feel or look bigger as far as copper spawns potentially. And as far as online goes, which we're all going to be playing and things like that, if you don't have copper scav, money grubbers becomes fairly unreliable. For the most part, we can say that if you don't have copper scav, money grubbers will almost never be better than share the wealth, which needs 16 piles of copper, but you really want sort of 17. So without copper scav, money grubbers pretty much never better than share the wealth. With copper scavs, you're in the ballpark for being better than share the wealth. But if you have copper scav, money grubbers is definitely better than hazard pay. Keep in mind though, we need copper scav. 2 cards. 2 cards. No copper scav, money grubbers is a liability. Slightly a liability. Now, right, if we look at, 11, 17, 18, 9, 11, 14, 12, 13, and 12. I didn't do the math on like by the end of this what's better after the I didn't do that math. I don't really care. For the most part, right, I like to generalize. I like to think in terms of principle as far as exactly quantifiable, right? We want to quantify, but I like the generalization of quantifiable data. That makes sense. Does that make sense at all? Am I just babbling at this point? The point is, if we get to if we're going to average out these 10 missions and compare what we actually net gain with money grubbers compared to hazard pay, that doesn't really interest me. And the point is, right, the big picture here is if you don't have copper scav, money grubbers is not consistent. It's not consistent. It can be with a little bit of luck. It can trigger every map, every single map. But it feels a little bit luck based, right? 13, 13, 15, 12, 13, 11, 14, 13, 12, 13. Money grubbers triggered most of the time. And with these 15s and these 14s, sort of help compensate for the 11s and the 12s. Right? And this one, though, about the same. In my first run, though, 11, 17, 18, 9, 11, 14. Slightly more wild numbers, but again, not super consistent. I will say, though, not as inconsistent as I thought. Right? But keep in mind, this is me putting in every single effort to scour the map entirely. If I saw a car and I knew that I could be blown up, right, I was running to that car. I was taking lead. I was charging forward. I was trying to be really aggressive as far as getting to all the potential copper spawns first so that I can pick them up, count them, and make sure that they're not destroyed in some way or another. every effort possible to do so. And these are the end results. So, let's talk about all the cards in general now, right? If you are not running Copper Scav, Money Grubbers, I'm going to say realistically, is about the same as Hazard Pay. It's about the same as Hazard Pay. There is some potential for Money Grubbers without Copper Scav to sort of pop off and be slightly better than Hazard Pay. But it won't be consistent overall, right? You'll miss a little bit on these missions, then you might hit real big on this mission and then miss again over here and hit big over here. And probably over the course of 10 missions, Money Grubbers will probably even out to about the same as Hazard Pay or probably slightly better. Realistically, right? As far as I can tell. With that being said, you do get to use Hazard Pay on the very first mission. But keep in mind, that's really only relevant unless we're playing at the very first checkpoint of a whole campaign, right? If you're starting off at Clean Sweep, you get some bonus copper given to you from the game, right? At Clean Sweep, you start off with, I don't remember, 1,500 copper or 1,000 copper, right? If you start off in the later checkpoints, the game gives you more than 250 copper, right? But if you start off at the very first mission of each of the campaigns, you begin with 250, which is not really enough to buy anything. Now, with Money Grubbers, you don't get anything at the beginning of the safe room. You get it at the next safe room, right? So just keep that in mind. I would say, in the most general sense, if we're just going to summarize it all, Money Grubbers, as far as net gain of copper goes, without Copper Scav, about the same or slightly better than Hazard Pay. You do miss out on that consistency. You do need to loot the entire map. You need to check literally everywhere. Literally everywhere. Because if you miss one pile of copper, all of a sudden you're behind. You're behind 30 or 60 piles of copper. So, and on Nightmare mode, that's not always possible. Right? So the same things that I was saying before as far as why I have Hazard Pay over Money Grubbers, I think for the most part stand true. Though I will admit that Money Grubbers is more consistent than I imagined it to be. So for the most part, if you are a gamer and you are going to scour every inch of the map and you know all the copper spawns and you are comfortable doing that even when things are not going well, even when your teammates are all dead or things are falling apart, if you can still loot the entire map consistently, Money Grubbers is about the same or is about equal to or slightly better than Hazard Pay. But will almost never be better than Share the Wealth. If we have Copper Scav, Money Grubbers is super duper consistent. Money Grubbers will always be better. Copper Scav Money Grubbers will always be better than Hazard Pay. Only in the most extreme circumstances where, like, you loot only a short amount of time, or like you loot just a tiny portion of the map, or all the cars get blown up, right? Like on the diner, most of the copper on the diner mission is in the parking lot cars of the diner. So if there's like tall boys running around over there when you're trying to get it, like before you're setting up, before you get the crates into the diner, you're clearing out that parking lot. If you blow up one or two of those cars before you loot them, you're probably missing out on like anywhere between like 3 to 5 piles of copper, most likely. Most of the copper on the diner is in those cars. But if you have Copper Scav and Money Grubbers, it's always better than Hazard Pay. And for the most part, it will be breaking even with Share the Wealth. For the most part, it'll be breaking even with Share the Wealth. Keep in mind, though, Copper Scav, Money Grubbers, it's 2 cards versus 1, Hazard Pay or Share the Wealth. Which is kind of makes sense, right? Like, kind of makes sense. Like, having 2 copper cards should be better than having 1, right? And if you're going to have 2 copper cards, then Share the Wealth. I mean, then Copper Scav and Money Grubbers make sense. If we were to run Hazard Pay and Share the Wealth, though, what does that put us at? 350 for us, right? But a 700 and, or no, 650 copper gain for the entire team. Where does that put us? I just thought of that right now on the fly, live, right here where I'm recording. And I don't have that number. But, because 16 is 402, 17 is 400 and something or other, 18 is 500 and something or other, 19 will be probably pretty close to 6. Man, it feels like if you're going to run 2 copper cards, and it depends on the way you look at copper. Let's sum it up this way. So if you're only concerned about how much copper you have, Copper Scav Money Grubbers is the best combo that you can do. If you're going to view copper from a team perspective, if you're planning on giving some of your copper to the team as far as buying upgrades or you're playing with your friends, then Hazard Pay and Share the Wealth becomes a better combo. Because in order for in order for Copper Scav and Money Grubbers to be better than Hazard Pay and Share the Wealth, you'll need around 20 piles of copper. And that was not consistent anywhere. Anywhere. Kind of interesting, right? If you're concerned only about how much copper you have, Copper Scav Money Grubbers is fine. If you view copper as a team resource, then Hazard Pay, Share the Wealth is better than the Copper Scav Money Grubbers Wampa combo. The other thing that I want to quickly talk about before we end this video here, the long freaking video, is the scavenger cards, right? Utility Scav, offensive Scav, support Scav. Those are also great resource generating cards. But at the same time, I almost always prefer having copper cards over those just because of team upgrades, as well as healing, except for support Scav. I think offensive Scav and support Scav are the two best scavenger cards. Now, utility Scav does have a nice nice items as far as their price point goes, right? Like toolkits. Huge value getting toolkits. Not having to buy toolkits and getting to open up the loot room consistently every single map without having to pay for it. Really nice. Pretty much negates the copper. When you open up a safe room, it has about 3 piles of copper in it. 3 to 4 for the most part. And so as a net gain for the team, it's usually around that 350-ish mark. Utility Scav will negate that. Also, if you get extra toolkits, you can open up doors and things like that. But when it comes to utility Scav, there's also ammo pouch, stun guns, and defibrillators, which I think are 3 items that are significantly less valuable than actually what their price point is. I always run a stun gun just because I play solo queue and I'm trying to solo clutch, and that's just the way I play. And for the most part, most of the missions spawn people so consistently that unless you're running cards that benefit from having a defibrillator, defibrillators are not that often used, I think, or that even that valuable, because as far as I can tell, they don't affect trauma at all. And it's a faster pickup. Well, when people get downed in the middle of a fight, they have like 300 points of health or something like that. Honestly, you shouldn't be picking anyone up during the middle of a fight. So when it comes to defibrillators, I don't think they're as valuable as people might be putting them at. And for the most part, like if people are going down, unless you have the medical professional, like a defibrillator is not going to be that great of a solution. So I think if you are going to run utility Scav, you probably want somebody on the team who's also running medical professional. Otherwise, you don't get the value out of utility Scav, I think. And just sort of in general, as far as all of the scavenger cards go, except for Copper Scav, the value is a little nuanced in that. Oh, grenade is 150, and I don't have to buy that. That's super cool, right? I don't have to buy that. We view that as economy. I don't have to buy a toolkit. That's economy. But really though, if we think about the primary sources of copper that we're generating on the map, looting copper in the map is one of our primary sources of copper. But its real value is in that it's a team effect and not an individual effect. The other main source of copper is the secondary objective. If you don't get that secondary objective, that's a minus 2,000 copper. Which again, so those two sources are a primary means of copper. If you are not running a copper card, like copper scav or hazard pay, and you don't end up getting your secondary objective, your copper is going to be really, really tight. You won't really have enough to buy anything in store, which hopefully is fine because you have some sort of scavenger card like offensive scavenger and things like that. But again, it's all that implied value that I think is sort of being misinterpreted in that. One, we don't get to pick what we find, especially for offensive scavenger. We want flashbangs or grenades to deal with mutations, and then pipe bombs and mollies to deal with the horde, and that can be all fine and dandy and things like that. But if your team is really looking to kill mutations, then there's just going to be more consistency in buying grenades at the start. And I find the value of like offensive scavenger is that as you're going through the mission, you will occasionally find that extra grenade and replenish your grenade supply. But for the most part, we want that. I guess the point is I'm looking for consistency. I like the consistency. The other big thing too is that healing trauma in particular, 400 copper at a med cabinet. Unless you have a teammate, unless you have a support character on your team who is running medical professional and trauma heals or whatever, right? I mean, the best trauma heal is medical professional, and unless you're using medkits or consistently, then trauma can be an issue and things like that. And I think trauma is the biggest issue as far as not having a copper card, because health is the most expensive thing in the game, and healing trauma in particular, right? So interestingly enough, I feel like just in a general sense, the copper cards are still the best resource because it's just universal money. And I think supplementing an economy card with a scavenger card is really good because I think the value, the best value that we can get out of the scavenger cards is the fact that we can pick up a resource in the middle of a mission. We can prepare all we want. We leave the safe room with all of our slots filled because we have a copper card and we're rich. But then in the middle of the mission, when things are going wrong and you have to burn extra grenades that you weren't expecting to, and I'm almost out of grenades and we're only halfway through the mission, that's when offensive scavenger really comes into play, right? You leave the safe room with a toolkit, you buy it with copper, and if you're not running a copper card, then, ooh man, buying that toolkit really feels bad, right? If your only source of copper is looting the map, which will net gain probably around, I mean, if we loot, 14 piles of copper, and one of them is 100, and most of them are 25s, and 5 of them are 50s, and you're probably getting about 500-ish copper per player from looting the map. And then if you get the secondary objective or not, you can probably get around 1,000-ish copper per map, depending on the second objective or not, and depending on the RNG of your copper piles and their size. All of a sudden, that toolkit feels very expensive. Which is why, again, I just think that copper cards in general are universally better, way more consistent, and having a scavenger card to supplement is really, really nice. I think that's when the scavenger cards really shine, is that you're supplementing. You're not relying on them in your primary source of your primary resource generation, but you're supplementing it, saving copper here and there, and finding an extra toolkit here and there, and things like that. Yeah, I've rambled enough. Let me know what you guys think of this video, and etc. And criticize the data here because I understand I understand. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in the future.